If you could find a seat, we will get started in a moment. Good morning and welcome to the Curry School of Education. Thank you for attending the Curry Research Lectureship Series. I am Joanna Williams and I'm an assistant professor here at Curry. This series is sponsored primarily by the Virginia Education Sciences Training, or VEST, Predoctoral Fellowship Program, which is supported by the U.S. Department of Education Institute of Education Sciences. The VEST program applies rigorous research methods and analytical techniques in the social sciences to study school and classroom effects. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Adam Gamoran. Dr. Gamoran was named president of the William T. Grant Foundation in 2013. He came to the foundation from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he held the John D. MacArthur Chair in Sociology and Educational Policy Studies. Dr. Gamoran's research career, which he's developed over the course of 3 decades and is still actively engaged in today, has focused on understanding educational disparities by attending to challenging issues like academic tracking, racial segregation, classroom organization, and curriculum reform. His work has been published and recognized both nationally and internationally, and has been supported by IES, NSF, NICHD, the Spencer Foundation, and of course the W.T. Grant Foundation. He is an elected member of the National Academy of Education and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and was twice appointed by President Barack Obama to serve on the National Board for Education Sciences. In his new role as president of the W.T. Grant Foundation, Dr. Gamoran has prioritized a focus on supporting research to deepen our understanding of the programs, policies, and practices that reduce inequality in youth outcomes, and on improving the use of research evidence in decisions that affect youth. This is a really critical focus that moves beyond identifying disparities. It's more about trying to change them. The important mission of the foundation has been very much aligned with our goals here at Curry and in the broader university community. So many of us have benefited from their generous support. During his talk today, Dr. Gamoran will discuss how his own work and past predictions about the state of educational inequality are aligned with the current state of affairs, how this connects to the foundation's new mission, and the kinds of funding opportunities available to dig into these critical issues. Dr. Gamoran will talk for about an hour, and we'll leave 15 to 30 minutes for discussion or questions. Please note that any additional or personalized questions after 12:30 can be addressed via email, as other meetings will be starting at this time. Before we welcome Dr. Gamoran, I just want to mention that the next talk as part of the Curry Research Lectureship Series will be on Friday, April 24th at 2 p.m. by Sandra Graham from UCLA. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Adam Gamoran.
Joanna, thank you for that marvelous introduction. Now I see why we selected you as a William T. Grant Scholar. What a pleasure it is to be here today. I've really enjoyed the meetings I've had so far. It's been a great opportunity to meet the VEST fellows, and I understand I'll have some more. We'll have some more chances for interaction. It's a happy day for me, especially because I led the predoctoral training program at Wisconsin for 10 years, and I found out yesterday that they're getting renewed. So, you guys got renewed last year. We're lagging a year behind you, but I was really glad to hear that. I have nothing to do with it anymore, but I still take a measure of pride in it. And what a better place to talk about reducing youth inequality than the institution founded by Mr. Jefferson. I was told to put that in the beginning of my talk. Of course, when Mr. Jefferson said that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, he was talking about men, and he wasn't talking about all men. And even today, some 200 and something years later, we have a ways to go in achieving an equal society. And this is the new major challenge that the William T. Grant Foundation is taking on. So the William T. Grant Foundation was founded in 1936, surprisingly, by William T. Grant, who was a store magnate Those of you who are my age or older may remember the Grant stores. They were what we call, in those days, 5 and dimes, like Woolworths or Kresge's or Ben Franklin. And the stores went out of business in the 70s, but luckily the foundation was already endowed. So the foundation is perpetual, even though the stores no longer exist. Mr. Grant was frustrated because he would hire what he thought were the best and brightest young men to manage his stores. And some were successful, and others were unsuccessful. And he wanted to know, why is that? And that's what led him to found a foundation dedicated to social science research to understand human behavior. He never did get an answer to his question, but there has been a lot of good work done at the Grant Foundation since then, and it's been a great honor for me to assume the leadership. The foundation has a tradition of addressing what are perceived as the most challenging questions over time. And we have a very nice timeline on our website if you want to know more of the history, how we funded Anna Freud and Jane Goodall and Dr. Spock. We did a lot of things that were prominent in their times. And so we tend to shift our research priorities with the time. At the present time, we have 2 major priorities for the research that we support. The first is understanding and improving the use of research evidence in decisions that affect young people. So here the argument is that the quality of evidence is high enough that it's worth paying attention to. This is especially true in education, where we've seen improvements in the quality of evidence over the past decade. And yet, when decisions are made, the research is rarely consulted. Sometimes the research is consulted after the decision is made to try to support the decision that's already in place, but we're interested in the use of research evidence at the time, in the process of making decisions about youth programs and policies. So why is that? And under what circumstance can we see evidence used in a more instrumental way, that is, in a way that actually shapes decisions? You know, we understand that decisions will never be completely guided by evidence, because decisions are always made in a political context, and there are multiple factors that go into making decisions. But we would like to see evidence at least part of the decision. After all, we're in the business of funding research. If the research evidence isn't used in making decisions, what are we doing? So that is what prompts our focus on the use of research evidence. So the second major focus of our research interests is the new one that we launched just over a year ago, and this is the Reducing Inequality Initiative. Inequality by economic, racial, ethnic, linguistic, and immigrant origins is pervasive in American society. And we have a lot of evidence on the nature and sources of inequality. In fact, there's more to learn on this, but we think enough is known that it ought to be possible to start crafting responses. What programs, policies, and practices can we undertake to reduce inequality in youth outcomes? And we're interested specifically in academic, social, and behavioral outcomes for young people between the ages of 5 and 25. Now, you can think about inequality in at least a couple of ways. One is in terms of the overall dispersion of an outcome, and the second is with respect to group differences. And our interest is in reducing the first and eliminating the second. We recognize that we're never going to completely eliminate inequality, and it's probably not even desirable. But there doesn't have to be as much inequality as we have now, and that's demonstrable because we haven't always had as much inequality as we've had now, and there are a lot of other countries that have less inequality than we have now. So it ought to be able to reduce the degree of inequality, and then group differences can be attacked head on. Now, reducing inequality is not the same as fighting poverty. Of course, fighting poverty is a big part of the challenge of reducing inequality, but our intention is to support a program of work in which fighting poverty is just one component We'd like to reduce inequality across the entire spectrum. An example is that today middle-class families struggle to send their kids to college due to the increased cost of tuition. So that's a dimension of inequality that should be addressed, as well as support for low-income kids. So one can reduce inequality by pulling down those at the top or by pulling up those at the bottom. And of course, we're interested in moving from the bottom up, not from the top down, as a strategy for reducing inequality. Only the former is of interest. Now, we're not the only ones to be interested in inequality these days. It's all over the headlines. Standards & Poor had a project about the damaging consequences of inequality. The president has turned his attention to income inequality. Income inequality threatens the world order, according to the Boston Globe. The Pope, the mayor of New York, and most recently, Janet Yellen, the head of the Federal Reserve. They're all about inequality. So we're not the only ones talking about this, and we hope that by supporting research that will actually answer some of the questions, we'll be contributing to this groundswell of interest in ways to reduce inequality and advance opportunity for young people. Now, we make a four-part argument, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I have some other stuff I want to talk about. But I'm happy to answer more questions about this. But we make a four-part argument about why we are focused where we are with respect to inequality. First, inequality is excessive. Levels of inequality are exceptionally high. And this is true whether you look historically at the USA or whether you compare the US to other nations. The degree of inequality in the US, on some measures, is the highest in the world. It's the only thing we lead the world in. That might be an exaggeration also, but we have an exceptionally high level of inequality. Second, high levels of inequality is economically and socially harmful. And this too has been demonstrated in a number of studies, most recently by Standards & Poor's, but others show how inequality is a drag on economic productivity, wastes the talent of young people who could be contributing economically, and is socially divisive and breaks or prevents social cohesion in our society, which is fundamental to democracy. So for all of these reasons, then, inequality is harmful. However, social policy can do something about it. Inequality is responsive to social policy. And this is a significant statement because, as I'll return to this topic later, there are many arguments out there saying the growth of inequality in a capitalist system is inevitable and inexorable. There's not much that can be done about it. And our position is that that is not true, that we can demonstrate both smaller, short-term efforts that have been successful at reducing gaps, and also longer-term social policies that have had a mitigating effect on the degree of inequality. So inequality is responsive to social policy, and if you accept points 1, 2, and 3, then you can see why we've taken the fourth stance, which is that we need research to help identify those programs, policies, and practices that do reduce inequality. So this is the foundation of our focus on reducing inequality. And I'm happy to say that the head of the Federal Reserve agrees with us. This is hot off the press. This is what she said last week. Research may be able to provide evidence on which public policies are helpful in building an economy in which people are poised to get ahead. It would also be beneficial to understand whether any policies may hold people back or discourage upward mobility. So this is essentially the focus of our interest, except that we're not interested only in economic inequality, but also in social, behavioral, and academic. And we are not only interested in social policies with a big P, but also policies that are more localized and get down to the level of practices, individual interactions within within settings where people interact face to face. So, my interest in inequality is long-standing, and one of the landmarks of my research career in addressing inequality was in response to an invitation to say something for a millennium issue of the journal Sociology of Education that was prepared in 2000, published in 2001. What did I think about, what was there to say about inequality? So I audaciously provided a forecast for the future of educational inequality. And my forecast was that racial inequality would decline to near zero over the course of the 20th century. Racial inequality in education, educational attainment, years of schooling attained, degrees obtained, and racial inequality in achievement, test scores. So that was my prediction. And I didn't just pull it out of the air. I had an argument behind it. During the 20th century, there was a substantial convergence, both in educational attainment and in test scores. And I argued that this convergence would create a virtuous cycle where the offspring of men and women who had more education than their forebears would then pay off in improved outcomes for the next generation. So I argued that that over the course of a century, actually 80 years, this virtuous cycle would come into play. Particularly in the 20th century, a convergence in high school completion and a narrowing test score gap would result in a virtuous cycle that would narrow education gaps over the course of the next century. And I said by 2010, we would know if my forecasts were correct, or at least we would have important signs about it. They told me not to stand in front of the screen, sorry. We would have important signs of it because the convergence in high school completion and the convergence in or the narrowing gap in test scores was really evident by around 1980. And so I thought the offspring of those who were in high school in 1980 would be in school then by 2010, and we would have their test scores, and we would then see the results. So that's what I predicted. So how are things looking? Unfortunately, not that good. And so I'm going to demonstrate. I wasn't completely wrong, but I certainly wasn't right, at least as far as the signals by 2010, 2012. So I'm going to lay that out for you and try to understand that. And then I also predicted no change in socioeconomic inequality. And I had certain reasons for that. We had witnessed persistent inequality during the 20th century. So despite changes in our economy, changes in technology, there had been no decline in the United States in inequality by social origins, by family income and occupational status and education status of the parents in educational attainment of the offspring. So we hadn't seen that in the 20th century, so no virtuous cycle to build on in the 21st. Also, in the United States, racial minority groups are a protected class. We've got laws that say no discrimination. There's no anti-discrimination law against poor people. And poor people don't have the same degree of mobilization that racial and ethnic minority groups do in the United States, as we can see in the dissipation of the Occupy movement, for example, and in many other ways. The dissipation of the rights of the power of unions in the United States. Many ways we can see the lack of mobilization for rights of the poor in contrast to the positive mobilization for rights of minority groups. So for these reasons, I predicted no change in socioeconomic inequality in education in contrast to meaningful change in racial inequality. So this prediction has actually turned out worse in some ways than I predicted, because in some ways, as I will demonstrate, in some ways things have stayed the same, but in some ways things have gotten worse. So I didn't predict that either. So yeah, so not doing that well in the prediction space, but hey, Yogi Berra said that prediction is difficult, especially about the future. And I have very much found that to be the case. So the questions that I'm going to address then in the next part of my talk are, first of all, what are the trends in educational inequality especially since 2000, because that was the focus of my prediction. Second, what lies behind the numbers? Third, what can we do about it? And so more broadly, how can research yield evidence on ways to reduce educational inequality? And you'll see, aha, I'm tying it in with our foundation's focus, and that's where I'm going to be driving towards by the end of the talk. So I'm going to go through a number of indicators. I'm putting this one up first because it fits my prediction the best. It's the only one where if I could just stop here and say, see, I was right. So there's 2000. And you can see that, so this is from the Digest of Educational Statistics based on census data. And the question is, who goes to college immediately after high school? Whether 2-year or 4-year college. Who's enrolled in college immediately after high school? And you can see persistence, a flat line, when we're comparing young people whose parents had a high school degree versus young people whose parents had a college degree. So no change. So it's about a 30 percentage point difference in those two groups who goes to college. And we can see decline now there was an uptick and then decline, and certainly the long-term trend is a decline in black-white differences in who goes to college after high school. A big part of this is community colleges, are a big part of the story. But nonetheless, it's quite striking to see the convergence for racial differences and the stability for socioeconomic differences. Now, you could look at this picture and say, well, it didn't take a genius to come up with these predictions. All you did was say that what happened in the past is going to happen in the future. And indeed, that is the source of my genius. As you see here, there was a flat trend in socioeconomic differences, and that's persisted, and a downward trend in racial differences, and that's persisted. So if I could stop the talk here, then I would have different conclusions. But unfortunately, that's not the end of the talk. Focusing in on high school completion, not just enrolling in college, but high school completion and college completion. These are the trends for black-white differences, and again, from the Digest of Educational Statistics, so this is public data. Anybody can look it up. Whoa. Help. Okay. So there's 2000. So you can see on the one hand, there has been increasing convergence in black-white rates of high school completion, only about a 5 percentage point difference, as contrasted with a 30 percentage point difference in 1970, a quick drop over the course of the 1970s, and a steady further decline since then. So that is what I predicted. But in contrast, the rates of college completion have not only failed to converge, but they've actually gotten worse. Now, if you think about it, this period here from the 70s through the 90s of stability in college completion with a decline in declining gaps in high school completion is quite extraordinary. Because what you're looking at here, I keep pushing the advance button instead of the pointer button, but what you're looking at here is, so as the gap declines, you're getting an increasingly heterogeneous group of African Americans who are completing high school, right? The population group of African Americans completing high school is becoming increasingly heterogeneous because more and more of them are becoming eligible for college, so to speak. And yet, rates of college completion stayed the same. So that means an increasingly heterogeneous group of college eligible students is graduating college at the same rate. So one should probably regard this as a very positive period, even though, of course, we'd like both indicators to converge. The best one could probably hope for would be a lag in the convergence, so first you get high school completion to converge, and then after that you get college completion to converge. So so this is a very positive period in the development of inequality. But since 1995, especially since 2000, when high school completion has continued to converge, college completion has gone in the opposite direction, which is what one might anticipate as a high school completion group, and therefore the eligible for college group becomes more heterogeneous. The gap between blacks and whites and who graduates from college has gotten worse. But this is a pretty strong signal of the weakness of my predictions and also of the weakness of U.S. society in advancing goals of equal opportunity and equal outcomes. What about with respect to high school and college completion by socioeconomic grounds? Well, the Digest of Educational Statistics doesn't give us those breakdowns by parents with high school and college degrees, so I took this from publicly available indicators from 3 national surveys of high school sophomores, the High School and Beyond Survey, the National Educational Longitudinal Survey, and the Educational Longitudinal Survey. So this is the high school sophomores in, people who were sophomores in high school in 1982, 1992, and 2010. And also you can see that the diagram is fudged a little bit because this is only an 8-year gap and this is a 12-year gap. So really these guys should be farther to the left and this line should be less sloped. Anyway, so sorry about that, but that, you know, this is the best I can do with PowerPoint. The point is that there was increasing socioeconomic gaps between 92 and 2000, declining socioeconomic gaps from 2000 to 2012, but the overall picture is one of stability. So no improvement in socioeconomic gaps in high school completion or college completion. In contrast to what we saw for race and ethnicity, for black-white differences rather, where there was improvement on one indicator and getting worse on the other. Okay, and now turning to test scores. So since 2000, on the one hand, the racial gap has declined very slightly. This is significant because after a steep decline during the 70s and 80s, by the mid to late 1980s, the decline stopped and, in fact, was reversed. So the gap in 1999 was as high as it was before, 2 decades earlier. So that's been reversed at least, so it's not getting worse, it's getting a little bit better, but at a much slower rate than I predicted. And socioeconomic differences have gotten worse lately. And this is consistent with work by Sean Reardon and others who've shown that socioeconomic differences, so that the gap between people in the 90th and 10th percentile on family income is now greater than the black-white gap in educational achievement. And the economic differences have been getting worse while the racial differences have been getting better. With respect to reading scores, it's a little more choppy, but the overall picture is the same. If we look at the trend in race differences, it's downward, and the trend in socioeconomic differences is probably flat or maybe a little bit worse after 2000 than before 2000. So much to be concerned about here. So to summarize the trends, the black-white gaps in high school completion and college enrollment have narrowed, but the gap in college completion has widened. There have been modest decline in racial achievement gaps, slower than either I or Justice O'Connor. I put her up there, in one of the affirmative action cases where Justice O'Connor wrote the opinion, she said, in 25 years or so, we probably won't need affirmative action in high school education because there won't be any remaining differences. So she was even more optimistic than I was. I thought it would take about 80 years. This is looking at trends in the late 20th century. My forecast was within 80 years we can, if current trends continue, we'll see an elimination of black-white differences. So what we've seen is in the last 13 years, a decline both in reading and in math of the black-white test score gap of 4 points. So if you project that out, it takes about 100 years to get to 0 points. And so that's where we are. So slow decline, not satisfactory. Socioeconomic gaps have remained steady in some areas, attainment, and gotten worse in others. So unfortunately, my predictions, as measured and balanced as I thought they were overly optimistic. So what lies behind these trends? Why have things not improved more rapidly in racial differences, and why have things not improved at all or even gotten worse in socioeconomic terms? Well, there was supposed to be a virtuous cycle. So this is the paper, and I think some of the students may have seen the paper that I wrote with Daniel Long and Sean Kelly, where we tried to examine the virtuous cycle. We looked at the payoff of improvements in parents' education, occupation, and family structure on the outcomes of their offspring. And so there was supposed to be a virtuous cycle where improvements in parent background would increase expectations, access to high quality instruction, peer group, positive peer group effects, etc. And then this would lead to a boost in child's educational attainment. And then those children would be the parents of the next generation, and the cycle would repeat. So that was the basis for the argument. But this has not worked out. Why is that? Well, there are a number of reasons, unfortunately. Perhaps the most important one is that educational attainment, we learned from a detailed analysis that Daniel and Sean and I did, educational attainment pays off less for blacks than it does for whites. So even as blacks have caught up in educational attainment, they can't pass their advantages on to their offspring to the same degree as whites do. And to give credit where credit is due, it was first suggested by some critics of our article, Carl Alexander, who wrote a commentary on my forecast paper, and then with one of his students wrote a paper that went into this more extensively. That was their suggestion. And then we went ahead and documented and looked at, we tested their hypotheses and showed them to be correct. The returns to parental education are about 16% lower for blacks than they are for whites, and that's been consistent. And in fact, the differential is even greater in the most recent period and most recent cohorts than in the earlier cohorts of the 20th century. And this holds for all levels of education, whether we're talking about the payoff to parents, high school completion, college enrollment, and college completion. The payoff is lower for black families than for white families. So this places a drag on the virtuous cycle. The virtuous cycle can't cycle through as efficiently as one would have hoped, as I naively predicted. It's dragged down by the lack of equal payoff. So why is that? Well, there are a number of reasons. First of all, although high school completion rates are practically equal between blacks and whites, on-time high school completion rates have not converged as fast as overall high school completion rates. And on-time completion is important for post-secondary chances. So even though the parents of white and black kids might be similar in their rates of high school completion, the white kids' parents are more likely to finish in 4 years, and the black kids' parents more likely to finish in 4 years or to have gotten a GED. And we know from more recent research by Richard Murnane and others that the GED, and James Heckman, the GED doesn't pay off in the labor market to the same degree that a high school diploma does. So that's the second reason why what looks like convergence in high school completion might not really be convergence in what you need to get ahead for the next generation. The payoff to GED lower than that of a high school diploma. Moreover, even when rates of educational attainment are equal, levels of wealth are unequal between blacks and whites, and this is an inevitable flaw in this virtuous cycle argument because as blacks may be catching up to whites in high school completion, they don't have the legacy of highly educated and wealth accumulation behind them that whites have had. Now, of course, I'm talking on average. There are first-generation whites as well as blacks, but on average, there's a difference in wealth. And so that also limits the payoff from educational attainment that blacks have been able to derive in contrast to whites. Another reason for possible differences in the payoff to educational attainment for whites as compared with blacks is school quality differences. So whether it's teacher sorting within schools or between schools, if the high school context is unequal, then blacks and whites who are both high school graduates may not equally be prepared for college, and there may then be indirect effects on the labor market. In addition to that, there's persisting residential segregation. So as we know that even as African Americans have moved into the middle class, they're overrepresented in segregated neighborhoods compared to white middle-class families. So residential segregation has not kept pace. Increases in residential desegregation have not kept pace with increases in educational attainment. Parents with higher levels of education then are constrained in their ability to confer the advantages of more education and higher status jobs onto their children, due in part to persisting residential segregation. And Sean Reardon is someone who's written about this as well. So the lower payoff to educational attainment is probably an important reason for the failure of the virtuous cycle to operate as I naively anticipated. But another major reason is the mass incarceration, which also occurred dramatically in the late part of the 20th century. So if the lower payoff to attainment has been a drag on the virtuous cycle, mass incarceration has shattered it. So there's been a dramatic increase in incarceration rates in the United States, as is well known, and African American males are dramatically overrepresented in the increase in incarceration. And so this, of course, reduces educational attainment for those who are incarcerated. And moreover, and more importantly for the virtuous cycle idea, is that parental incarceration, and particularly father's incarceration, is detrimental to children's future progression, both in cognitive and in non-cognitive outcomes. A number of studies have shown this. Among those is research by Anna Haskins, one of our former students who's now on faculty at Cornell, which shows both non-cognitive and cognitive detriments to children of fathers who are incarcerated, so very likely contributing to persisting and even increasing educational inequality. And the harmful effects are especially salient for African American boys because their fathers are overrepresented in the increase in incarceration rates. So mass incarceration may also contribute to the rise of single-parent families and the increasing race gap. The increasing race gap in single-parent families. And so this just spins the virtuous cycle into a vicious cycle, where incarceration drives lower levels of education, drives challenges in finding marital partners for African American women, and increases the race gap then in single-parent families, and contributes to their children less successful in school and in other outcomes. So these are the reasons, I think, that the predictions about converging outcomes by race have not come to be in the way that I predicted, but it also points in directions that we need to go if we're going to try to find new ways to reduce inequality. Now, what about the SES gaps? There, I set a much lower standard in my prediction. I just said things would stay the same. But that turned out to be partly wrong also, because some things didn't stay the same. They even got worse, and that's especially if you look at test scores. So one reason that SES gaps in educational outcomes have gotten worse is rising income inequality. So as income inequality is widened, that means high SES and low SES are farther apart, right, as the dispersion widens. Whether you're looking at SES distributions or income distributions, that's the case. So there are many ways to demonstrate increasing income inequality. This is my favorite picture. It comes from this guy, Noah, his blog, but it's based on Paul Krugman's essays, and the original source for the data is from Piketty and Saez. And so what you're seeing here is the share of income held by the top 10% of US income earners. Now, what percentage would it have to be if income were equally distributed? Well, it would have to be 10%, right? If the top 10% got 10% of the income, then that'd be a sign that income was equally distributed. Well, back in 1917, it was about 40%. And through the Roaring 20s and up until the Great Depression, things got worse and worse until by just before the Great Depression, it was almost 50% of income was earned by the top 10% of the population. So that's a pretty high degree. And then we went through what's been called the Great Compression. So both the Depression and the post-war years contributed to a lower degree of inequality through the 1970s up until about 1980. And then about 1980, we've gone through what Krugman calls the Great Divergence, where we've gone in the opposite direction. So income inequality in the US is back up to about 50%. It's approximately the highest degree that it's ever been. And I especially like this chart because it shows the difference in measures of inequality whether you include capital gains or not. So the open circles here, this is just earned income. And the filled in triangles, that's including gains from investments. And for most of our history, those two lines have been more or less the same. But in recent times, there's a big gap between the share of income held by the top 10% if you only focus on earned income versus focusing on capital gains. And capital gains boosts the share by another 5%. By another 5 percentage points, I should say. So a big part of rising inequality in the most recent years has been the fact that there are so many capital gains, both earned and untaxed, and the tax rates are so low on capital gains for the top 10% of our population. So this is only the picture if you compare the US to itself historically. If I showed you a picture of the US compared to other countries, you would see similarly extraordinarily excessive inequality in income. And so this is part of the reason that things have gotten even worse in socioeconomic terms, is that what it means to be in the top 10%, what it means to be in the bottom 10% has increasingly diverged. A second reason is that families at high income levels are increasing their investments in children at faster degrees than families with low income levels. Everybody's trying to increase their child investment, but the gap is widening. So this is an example from Putnam's new book, Our Kids, which has been getting a lot of attention recently. And this chart is actually, I took it from The Economist, the magazine The Economist, which they created based on Putnam's data. So this is about time spent by parents in childcare for developmental purposes. So the example they give is reading the child a story, that's developmental childcare. Changing the child's diaper, that's not developmental childcare. So this is increases in the number of minutes of childcare provided. And you can see that, and this is the comparison of parents with a high school degree versus parents with a bachelor's degree. So you can see that everybody's spending more time, more developmental time with their children, but high income or highly educated parents are increasing at a faster rate. And there are many other indicators that show this. And the book Wither Opportunity, edited by Greg Duncan and Richard Murnane, has a chapter, actually 2 chapters, all about parent investments in their children. And on many indicators show the same thing, increasing investments and increasing at a faster rate for highly educated or high income families. So this, I think, is a second reason why, especially for cognitive outcomes, the socioeconomic gap in test scores is increasing over time. A third reason is increasing income segregation and increasing concentration of poverty. And research by both Sean Reardon and Patrick Sharkey, and it's just coincidence that I happen to be throwing in the name of a lot of William T. Grant scholars. Anyway, work by both of these folks has demonstrated this phenomenon. Here's a graph, or a chart rather, that I took from Sharkey, and it happens to be Philadelphia, but he uses it to illustrate the increasing concentration of poverty in many American cities. So here's Philadelphia in 1970. The darker colors are poverty rates, higher levels of poverty, and you can see how the concentration, this is the same picture. The only thing that's different is what's filled in. And you can see that increase in concentration of poverty during that period. And so this creates environments then where it's more difficult for children from low-income families to succeed in school, and may also be partly attributable for the increasing socioeconomic effect on test scores. So, what are we going to do about it? What do we need to know to craft effective responses to growing inequality? Well, according to the chair of the Federal Reserve, we need more research. Yes! Glad to see that. We don't know everything about what generates inequality, but we know enough to begin to build a body of evidence on potential gap closers. And that's where the William T. Grant Foundation comes in. So we need a research agenda that will help us build, understand, test, and improve programs, policies, and practices that reduce inequality. And we have a specific meaning when we say programs, policies, and practices. Programs are coherent sets of activities oriented towards accomplishing some goal. Policies are ways of allocating resources or regulating behavior. And practices are the way individuals interact with one another directly. Could be face-to-face, could be through electronic media, but individual interactive. When we say build, understand, test, improve, we're trying to signal that we don't prioritize one methodology or one research question over another. So this is not only about testing specific interventions or programs, but it's also about understanding ways to reduce inequality, about building new ways to reduce inequality, about improving ways to reduce inequality. And you can make progress on that through interpretive insights as well as through testing hypotheses. But we do insist on work that's about reducing inequality as opposed to identifying the contours or the sources of inequality, which there's more still to be known about that. That's just not where we're working. So some examples of support. So to pick out some examples, I decided to turn to 3 recent books that have specific ideas about ways to reduce inequality. And they have to do with families, neighborhoods, and schools. And just to put out some ideas for new directions for research on reducing youth inequality. For families, so healthcare is a big domain. And it's perhaps the domain where we've made the most recent progress in the last 5 years is extending healthcare to people who don't receive employer-provided health care and aren't poor enough to get free health care. So that's an area where we've made a lot of progress. What about marriage incentives? So a lot of inequality is generated by the fact that children in single-parent families don't have the same level of resources to support their development. Of course, I'm talking about an average. I'm not talking about each and every case. There are many single-parent families that are very strong and are very successful with their kids. But on average, single-parent families have a more challenging time of improving their children's outcomes. And so incentives to marriage might help. Incarceration reform is a huge one. As I argued earlier, that mass incarceration has shattered the virtuous cycle with respect to reducing inequality and black-white inequality in education. And so this could be a prime area for improvement. Family leave. So one thing, if we compare the United States to countries in Europe, European countries tend to have family investment policies that extend opportunities. And in the US, we tend to have opportunity hoarding policies. So if you bear a child and you would like to take time out to raise your child, then you have to give up the income. And so that's a trade-off that middle-class families can make. Middle-class two-parent families, anyway, can make that trade-off. But single-parent families and economically disadvantaged families can't make that trade-off in the United States. But in Europe, where there's a paid family leave policy, they can do that. So that would be another example of approach to reducing inequality. So Putnam talks about all of these. Actually, he talks about families, neighborhoods, and schools in his book. So it's a little bit of a cheat to put it up here. But families is one big area that are discussed in the concluding chapter of our kids. What about neighborhoods? So Patrick Sharkey, in his recent book, Stuck in Place, says there are two basic strategies to improving neighborhood support for youth development. And one is mobility. Let's move kids from poor neighborhoods to rich neighborhoods. And he says the research on this is pretty clear that it's hard to make a lot of progress with that. The findings have been disappointing, not completely negative, but disappointing. And thinking about doing this at a large scale, it's hard to wrap your head around. It would require essentially economically integrated neighborhoods everywhere. So he says, let's not give up on targeted programs to move disadvantaged families. Let's not give up on scattered site housing, housing diversity within neighborhoods. But that's not the answer to the problem. The second answer has to be the other strategy, which is investment. Let's invest in our disadvantaged neighborhoods, and let's make these improvements comprehensive rather than piecemeal, such as through the Promise Neighborhood program, which is based on the Harlem Children's Zone as an example of comprehensive neighborhood, school, healthcare reform efforts that have shown signs of success. So the concluding chapter of Stuck in Place is another example. Now, both Sharkey's book and Putnam's book are the kind of works where they spend 5 chapters showing you where all the problems are, and then the concluding chapter is about what can we do about it. And that means that there's not a lot of detail in the what can we do about it, but there is a good laying out of a research agenda. And so that's useful for our purposes. But the next book that I want to share with you, which is Restoring Opportunity by Greg Duncan and Richard Murnane, they had a huge volume about what all the problems are. That's called Wither Opportunity. It's an edited volume that came out in 2011. Then they followed that up a couple years later with Restoring Opportunity. So instead of having a concluding chapter to Wither Opportunity, they have a whole new book with examples of programs that can potentially reduce inequality. So school finance reform is a big area of improvement. It's still the case in the United States that school finance is based on property taxes. Property taxes are unequal, and property is unequal, and so the tax revenues generated on property taxes are unequal. And it's hard to imagine that we could reduce inequality in education without doing something about the basic financing of education. Now, the objection we always hear, and it's a reasonable objection, is that research has shown that throwing money at schools doesn't do any good. I think that objection is accurate. But what that means is that we can't just throw money at schools. We have to use money in ways that have been demonstrated to be effective. We have to use evidence to make these decisions. But the effective programs are not going to be free. So school finance reform, it's going to be part of the response. A second promising area for research is standards-based accountability in the post-NCLB era. As you know, we are moving from a federal system of accountability where everybody is subject to the same accountability regime to a system where there are 50 different accountability regimes, each determined by the state. Now, the waivers to No Child Left Behind required each state to set up its own accountability system, but in the waiver period, there were certain elements that every state had to have. Now, in the next version of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, at least as revealed in the draft by Senators Alexander and Murray, it appears that each state will be able to set up its own accountability system. There will have to be tests. There will have to be disaggregation of test scores. But beyond that, each state is free to figure out what the accountability system is, what the sanctions are, and everything. So we're going to have a wide range. So this is bad for the children, I think, but it's good for researchers because variation, we thrive on variation. So there's going to be 50 different accountability systems, and will give us a chance to get a better handle on the impact of certain attributes of accountability on improving outcome trends. And comprehensive school reform then is another approach that kind of got shifted to the side, but has now come back under the language of school turnaround, turning around the trajectories of low-performing schools. And whether we're talking about charter schools or other specialized programs, I think comprehensive reforms is another way to go in education. So restoring opportunity, they're not former William T. Grant scholars, but Duncan's on our board of trustees and Murnane's a member of the scholar selection committee. So it's not totally coincidence that I picked out these 3 books to highlight for you as resources you can go to that point towards new directions for research on reducing inequality. So I'll conclude by arguing that US policy can address inequality. We're not paralyzed. The situation is not hopeless. In today's rhetoric, inequality sometimes seems inevitable. And Piketty's fundamental argument is that the returns to capital exceed income growth. So if people who have wealth are getting faster returns than people who are just trying to work for a living, then growth and inequality seems inevitable. But we can demonstrate that while inequality, you probably can't get rid of, and probably wouldn't want to get rid of inequality entirely, it doesn't mean inequality has to be as high as it is today. After all, it hasn't always been this great, and there are other places where it isn't as great. So inequality does respond to social institutions, and institutions are amenable to policy. Now, I took this photo. I wasn't there in 1965, but I was at the Johnson Museum in Austin, Texas, where they have this. So I took the photo of the photo. So I took this photo to commemorate the signing of the War on Poverty. And I'm going to use this as an example of inequality being responsive to social policy. Now, you might want to say, well, what do you mean, war on poverty? War on poverty has not been won. We still have poverty. And yet, poverty would be worse without it, as our colleagues at the Russell Sage Foundation have shown. Programs like food stamps, school lunches, the earned income tax credit, housing and unemployment assistance, all elements of the war on poverty, all effective in reducing inequality and particularly making poverty less prevalent than it would be without them. So other programs, policies, and practices have also reduced the effects of inequality on children. So examples, high-quality early childhood programs, programs that promote healthy parenting, family school engagement programs, small classes in the early elementary grade, social psychological interventions with adolescents, financial aid assistance with college students. All of these have been demonstrated in small-scale studies to reduce inequality or reduce the effects of inequality in one generation on the outcomes of the next generation. So there are great prospects for reducing inequality, and in particular for research that will help us understand the most effective ways to reduce inequality. The constraints of disadvantage are not unbreakable. Now, if all these programs work, why has inequality gotten worse in recent years? Well, effective responses have emerged, but they're modest compared to the scope of the problem. It's a really big problem. And we're going to need a concerted effort over a long period of time with large investments to get purchase on this. Also, programs take time to have their effects, and all too often the programs are funded for a limited period of time, and the effects of the programs are tested too soon for the effects to demonstrate their impact. My colleague Jeffrey Borman has shown that school reforms take 3 to 5 years to take hold, and we've seen the studies of high-quality early child care may take a decade or longer to emerge. And so there's, in addition to the time dimension, there's a need for multiple efforts across multiple spheres, not only education or only healthcare or only discipline reform or justice reform. Family, health, neighborhood, school, and workforce all need to be part of the problem at the same time. Finally, programs, policies, and practices work differently in different contexts. So we need to move from understanding what works to understanding what works for whom and under what circumstances if we're truly going to reduce inequality. It's all about implementation. All too often, US policy is to hoard opportunities for the advantage instead of extending opportunities to the disadvantage. This is especially the case with tax policies, where we give a deduction for mortgages. You can only benefit from that if you own a home. We don't charge taxes on very expensive health care benefits. Well, you can only benefit from that if you have a job that provides those health benefits. There are all kinds of tax benefits for people who have wealth that people who don't have wealth or income, high income, can't benefit from. Mortgage write-offs, child care, college saving credits, untaxed health care benefits. In addition, there are labor market policies, and as I mentioned already, the lack of family leave is another opportunity hoarding policy in the US. So if you have a partner with a high income, then you can take time out when you have a baby. If you don't have a partner, or you don't have a partner with income that will support a family on its own, you can't take time out because you would lose your income otherwise. European nations have more inclusive policies in all of these domains, and we can learn from that about approaches to reducing inequality in the US. So let's experiment to see what works here. High quality social science research can play a key role in identifying conditions that support lower degrees of inequality. We want to help stimulate and support this work, not just in education, but in the justice system, child welfare, workforce transition. So all of these are domains where we hope to support new work on reducing inequality. Immigration is another one. So the hallmarks of our approach, there's probably 1,000 foundations interested in inequality, but we focus on, well, first of all, we focus on research, so that probably cuts out 975 of the 1,000. But in addition to that, we focus on young people. Second, our position is that in the long run, the research we support will lead to action. Third, action that will build, that's why we want to support research to build, test, understand, improve, et cetera. We realize that no single study will be transformative, but we hope that results will accumulate to guide policy and practice in the long run. Third, we want to support tools that will benefit many researchers. And fourth, we support interdisciplinary research. Many of the studies we support are themselves interdisciplinary, and the portfolio as a whole involves people from many disciplines. And so we seek researchers to answer this call. So the last thing I want to tell you then is what you can do if you want to respond to this call for new research, either on reducing inequality or on the use of research evidence. So what funding opportunities are there? So we choose our research interests based on what's going on in the world. We begin with a set of preconceptions. You know, there are some foundations where charter schools, it's all about charter schools. We'll support research as long as it's on charter schools. So that's not our approach. Our approach is to say inequality is a problem. You figure out what the solution is, and if you can come to us with a compelling case, we'll fund your research. And we favor an interdisciplinary approach to research. So we want to support high-quality research to ensure that young people from diverse backgrounds reach their fullest potential. There are 4 different types of research, 4 different types of grants. We support major research grants, the William T. Grant Distinguished Fellows, which is a mid-career award, the William T. Grant Scholars, which is an early career development award, and we have a small portfolio of youth services improvement grants that are directed only in New York City. So to apply for a research grant, there's a 2-step process. And by the way, I should probably go through this really quickly, because here at the Curry School, you guys are all over this. When Leslie asked me who I wanted to meet with, I entered Virginia in the search term on our website, and I got a long list. So there may be possibly more grants at the University of Virginia than any other institution. I haven't counted, but there are definitely a lot of grantees here at Virginia. But for the 1 or 2 of you that don't know this already, we have deadlines in January, August, and May for letters of inquiry, which are basically 5-page mini proposals. And so within 4 to 6 weeks, you'll get a response, and those are reviewed internally for their current interest. And then about 15% of the letters of inquiry generate an invitation for a full proposal. And those go out for external review and are reviewed internally. And then about 1/3 of those that go out about 1/3 of the full proposals are ultimately funded. Most of the ones that get externally reviewed, then the principal investigator has a chance to respond to the reviews, and then ultimately there's a staff recommendation to the board on which proposals should be funded, and the board is the ultimate decision maker. The William T. Grant Scholars Program, as I mentioned, is a career development program, and got two people, Joanna Williams and Noel Hurd, both current William T. Grant scholars, so got plenty of expertise around here to help guide you if you're a young scholar within 7 years of getting your first your PhD or your terminal degree. It's a career, you have to be in a career ladder position, so it's mostly assistant professors who apply for this, but you don't have to be an assistant professor as long as you've got a permanent career position. You have to be nominated by your institution, and only one, a major division of institution, like the Curry School, can only nominate one candidate per year. But you could have multiple, like arts and sciences and education, both nominate candidates in the same year. These awards provide $350,000 over 5 years, and they require a research plan and a plan for mentoring. But the idea here, again, is it's not a grant to do a specific project. Rather, it's a grant to develop as a scholar, and the focus is on stretch. So how will this grant take your research in a new area? Sometimes it's a methodological stretch, so adding a mixed methods component to your work. Sometimes it's a substantive stretch, bringing in a discipline orientation that you hadn't previously considered that would add a new dimension or answer new questions within your field of interest. And then you identify mentors who will help you move into this new area or add this new dimension to your research portfolio. So we publish guidelines for the Scholars Program in December, and then the application deadline is in July. We also have a Distinguished Fellows. This is a mid-career program, and the idea here is that it goes either to researchers to immerse themselves in a practice or policy setting, or to policymakers or practitioners to immerse themselves in a research setting. And these awards provide 6-month to 2-year fellowships at the level of $175,000. Okay, so now I'm happy to answer questions either about the substantive material I presented or about applying for grants. I was supposed to leave 15 to 20 minutes, and I think I've left 17 minutes, so pretty good. Thank you. I'm going to stand over here for a change. What questions can I answer? Yes.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I wanted to get your thoughts on which policies that you mentioned you think are most politically viable, since for a policy to work, it has to be both effective and adopted.
Yeah, so that's a great question. First thing I would say is that there's a lot more political viability if you think about the state level than the federal level. It's hard to get anything done at the federal level. But states, we've got lots of examples of policies that can be implemented that you might have thought were impossible. Think of marijuana reform as the latest example, but going back a little ways, welfare reform. So welfare reform started because states got waivers to existing welfare policy, and states like Wisconsin demonstrated that a different kind of welfare approach to welfare could increase incentives to work without creating starvation and high levels of deprivation. And that became the basis for the welfare reform of the Clinton era. And so I think in education, in family policies, well, healthcare is another example, right? So the Massachusetts healthcare system was the model on which the Affordable Care Act was built. And you know, I like to say about the Affordable Care Act, it's a terrible system. The only thing that's worse is what we had before the Affordable Care Act. And so there again, it's an example of state policy reform that ultimately led to federal policy reform. So I would argue there's a much wider range of potential policies that could be enacted at the state level than school finance reform is another one, although we know very little about state variation, about the consequences of state variation in school finance reform because it's so difficult to compare states. And actually we will shortly announce, it was just approved by our board, a grant to Bruce Baker at Rutgers University, which will create a national database of school finance inequities for every school district in every state in the U.S., and that will help us understand better whether some state finance reforms have actually resulted in lower degrees of inequality. It's an open question because, as I was saying before, it's not just about the money, it's what you do with the money. So that's a way of perhaps attacking the premise of your question. I'm a little reluctant to say which specific policies are more likely. I don't think we're likely to see European-style social welfare states in the United States anytime soon. But certainly it's plausible that we'll see education reforms of the sort that have been demonstrated to be effective, whether it's wraparound social services, community school type things, whether it's universal preschool, whether it's, there's a huge amount in development, excuse me, teacher development right now. So whether it's about recruitment or professional development to help teachers improve their practice, we're likely to see reforms in that area. So I guess the last thing I would, charter schools, trying to take the best of charter schools and do them more widely. I guess the best I can say is that my hesitance to answer this question directly is the reason why we don't think we have the answer. We want the research community to generate the potential answers, to convince us that promise, and to provide the funding so that they can go out and build, understand, improve, and test those. Yes, Nancy.
So, so one thing I was thinking that you did not mention explicitly in your discussion of the reasons for the differences versus lack of, or convergence versus lack of convergence in gaps is issues of racism. Although I think it was implied in many of the things. And so along those lines, thinking about, and so we know that whether it's explicit or whether it's issues of implicit bias, that white youth and youth of color have different experiences of school, of workplace, of trying to get hired, et cetera, that influence it. And so we also know that there's overlap of race and socioeconomic status. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about intersectionality and how you think about, that focus was on dividing this,
Yes.
white-black gap versus socioeconomic gap. But these things are very intersectional. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of...
So I see those as two different questions. One about where is racism in this story, and the second about intersectionality of socioeconomic and racial differences. So with respect to where is racism in this story, so clearly we have persisting racism in the United States, and that has been on vivid display in very recent years, particularly in the justice sphere, or the injustice sphere, but also in education in many ways. Clearly racism is not the whole story, because it's not like there was less racism in the 70s, and yet we saw a very sharp decline in educational inequality throughout that period, both in test scores and in attainment. So I think what that demonstrates is that it's possible to reduce inequality even in the face of persisting racism. Moreover, there is less racism in the United States now than there was, say, in the 1950s, let alone at the turn of the 20th century. No question about that. So to say that there's less racism is not to say that there's no racism. Clearly there is persisting racism, both implicit and, in some cases, explicit. Probably the ratio is increasingly more implicit and less explicit, but there are all kinds of microaggressions that researchers have done a lot to bring to light, to demonstrate, still pervasive in American society. So, so I would say the equalization of black-white gaps in educational outcomes have occurred despite persisting racism, and persisting racism is not the reason that the gaps in that the education gaps stopped improving in the late 20th century, nor that they have improved more slowly than I predicted in early 21st century. So racism is a big part of the black-white inequality story, but it's not a big part, at least as I see it, in the trends in black-white inequality. Intersectionality, though, is a big part of both, and I didn't talk about that, and it's really good of you to bring it out. So the argument is that, so to say that socioeconomic inequality will persist and black-white inequality will diminish is, of course, to recognize that not all black-white inequality will diminish, because part of the race inequality is based on socioeconomic, or is grounded in socioeconomic differences. But the argument here is that as educational outcomes improve, that will have payoffs in labor market for the next generation. So that will reduce race differences in economic circumstances. Now, that occurs more slowly than I perhaps acknowledged originally, because it's not just about income and socioeconomic status. It's not just about income and occupational status. It's also about wealth, and it's also about residence. And these things are more slow to improve than what job you have, because these things are multi-generational, not single-generational. So, I may have been a little naive, but I think the basic insight that you can get declining race gaps without getting declining socioeconomic gaps is correct. That one is not necessarily tied to the other. And it gets back to the point I made earlier about inequality as the overall dispersion versus inequality as group differences. So it's possible to mitigate group differences, and that will reduce inequality overall, but doesn't eliminate inequality. So intersectionality is a huge part of the story, but it's not the whole story. Socioeconomic differences account for about a third of the race gap, whether it's educational attainment or educational achievement beyond the school entry. So there are a big black-white gap, and then maybe if we bring wealth into account, maybe it accounts for half of the rate of the black-white gap, but there's still a very large gap remaining even within the same economic levels. So we need to figure out ways to reduce that are distinguishable. You didn't ask explicitly about other communities of color, but you might have, and I think it's implied by your question about intersectionality. So in my original article, I said, I'm not going to talk about Latinos because the story is complicated by immigration. And that is still the case. If you try to understand trends in Anglo-Hispanic achievement or attainment rates, it's complicated to do so because the population is changing over time. And the population has changed in different ways as immigration has gone up and down, as Latino immigration has come from one country of origin to another country of origin. So I guess the best I could say, so I couldn't make a forecast about this. I can say that many of the measures that I've described that both contribute to and have helped to relieve black-white inequality have also contributed to and helped relieve inequality between Hispanics and Anglos. But the story is more complicated, and I don't think it's useful to, or you have to have a lot of caveats if you show the trends. You don't really know what you're looking at unless you bring immigration into the picture in a big way. Which is one of the reasons why immigration, I hope, will be a new focus of research at the foundation. Yospa?
So I want to build on the intersectionality in the question by asking about other dimensions that you don't talk about, and one in particular being gender. When it comes to higher ed, right, gender is becoming a big and important factor, and one that intersects with particularly race. So African American females actually do as well as white men. The African American males are really the ones that are doing particularly poorly in higher education. So to what extent, these patterns get complicated, and to what extent does foundation pay attention to other forms of inequality?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have prioritized inequality by income or socioeconomic status, inequality by race or ethnicity, inequality by linguistic origin, inequality by immigrant status. And we've said that you can make the case for other dimensions of inequality as well. Of course, gender is a particularly interesting case because in education, the gender inequality has reversed itself on most indicators. Not all indicators, but most indicators. Women now graduate high school and enroll in college, complete college, same levels, and are increasingly advantaged over men. But there are some high-status college majors where men still have advantages over women, and majors with economic payoffs. So I think it would be the easiest to make the case for a focus on gender as it intersects with one of the other dimensions. The example you gave of African American males, or there might be other conditions where it's African American females, would be a very strong case to make and would easily be supportable with our focus. A focus purely on gender in higher education would be a bigger lift, would have a harder case to make. We haven't ruled it out of hand, but you know, we have limited resources and we've established other priorities. Same thing for inequality on the basis of sexuality. So again, if you talked about sexual orientation and race, it would fit squarely within our focus. If it's only about sexual orientation, you'd have to make a strong case. We have not ruled it out of hand, but it's not what we've prioritized. Well, I think we know what that, I could put another book up there, The Rise of Women by Dupree and Bookman, and show the patterns of the reversal in the gender effects and the increasing advantage of women over men. So that would be easy to put up, but it would be more interesting to put up the patterns as they intersect with race and ethnicity, I think. Yeah. So I haven't looked at them, but I think that would be of interest.
So this is not really about this specific thing, but maybe to suggest a little bit of a thought idea, which is if you put in there life, just to take gender for example, you took life expectancy, you'd have a different picture around inequality than you might have around income. Or and I suspect if you started to broaden out to some other aspects to measure quality of life. And so the question is whether the foundation and even in general, the idea of trying to think about what we want to have equal, to be broadened. I mean, for example, we use income, and that seems to be the conversation of we want everybody to increase their income and have less inequality. Not that I'm saying that's unimportant, but that there may be
What about
other
well-being? What about
well-being,
satisfaction?
yeah, satisfaction.
Yeah, sure.
Contentment about where you're
Happiness.
living
Contentment,
and things like that seem,
Yeah.
that people are working
Yeah.
on saying that be important. So I just wondered where the foundation was.
Well, a couple things. So first of all, our focus is on youth. So we wouldn't we wouldn't support research that was looking at longevity because of the focus on youth. But physical health, obviously, job satisfaction, satisfaction with where you're living, happiness. These are all things that you could look at with 25-year-olds. Wouldn't have to be 85-year-olds. So the foundation has a long history of research on physical health. That's not what we've prioritized. We've prioritized in the Inequality Initiative. We've prioritized academic, social, behavioral, and economic outcomes. So mental health would be very much included, but physical health would not. And again, we haven't ruled it out entirely. We've said you have to make a compelling case for this. We've done this because we think there are a lot of other sources to go for research support in the health arena, and perhaps less in some of the other arenas. So, so it's a matter of priorities based on our resource constraints, not based on interests. I think, as a matter of principle, economic outcomes, it's not all about economic outcomes, and we'd certainly be interested in what we call social and behavioral outcomes, civic participation, satisfaction. These would all fit within our social and behavioral space, so that could be supported.